This is not good.
Welcome back to Monday Macabre, a weekly series dissecting a horror game up until Halloween, and tonight we're going to be taking a look at a movie tie-in game I grew up playing a lot when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and boy, not even my nostalgia can come in the way of all the problems littered in this very game. But before we get into all that, 1999's The Mummy has gone down as an entertaining flick featuring plenty of adventure, scares, romance, and Brendan Fraser leading the way, all wrapped up in a neat little bow by writer-director Steven Sommers. Being an action-adventure remake of the Boris Karloff horror classic, it has no right being as good as it is, and yet it still delivers on the fun thrills to this day. And with all the treasure hunting and perilous traps characters must evade, it makes sense to do a video game tie-in, especially with how successful the Tomb Raider series was in the 90s. Development duties were handled by Rebellion, a studio with plenty of hits under its belt like Alien vs Predator and Sniper Elite. And yes, I know this is technically not a horror game, but it's not without various horror game tropes to have a little creep factor to it, so I give it a pass. Like the movie, the game follows Rick O'Connell, a former Legionnaire who leads an expedition to the lost city of Hamunaptra. Unbeknownst to Rick and the gang, the mummified body of Imhotep is buried beneath because 3,000 years prior, Imhotep was cursed after murdering the pharaoh and attempting to resurrect his lover, Aksunanun. And so when researcher Evelyn swipes the Book of the Dead found by a rival expedition, yada yada, you've seen the movie, you know the plot. Instead of doing a one-for-one recreation of the movie's story, the game opts for a truncated retelling that omits most of the plot threads and characters. The gung-ho Americans are gone. The museum curator, gone. The Arab warden, he is gone. It's just Rick, Evelyn, Jonathan, Imhotep, and Benny, with added cameos from Ardith Bey and Aksunanun.
You may have killed us all. You have unleashed a creature that we have feared for more than 3,000 years.
The game developers really rest on the players' shoulders in hopes that you've seen the movie, because if you haven't, you're going to be very lost since you only get the bare minimum. It's disappointing that there aren't levels based on scenes like the biplane fleeing Imhotep's sandstorm or the camel race. There's a bonus level set in Cairo that you can unlock by the end, but that's about it. But before I get any deeper into the problems with this game, there are some notable pluses that should not get overlooked. The game is set primarily in Hamunaptra, and the developers get creative crafting new parts of the necropolis not seen in the movie. So at the very least, fans of the film will get a kick out of seeing certain locales and landmarks like the Statue of Anubis, the Embalming Room, and the Treasure Chamber. The game also does a decent job at recreating the movie's atmosphere. When I was younger, I would get such a thrill out of gunning down mummies while Jerry Goldsmith's music blasts in the background, juxtaposed with tiptoeing around ancient ruins, unsure of what's ahead. Sort of like the fogginess of the Silent Hill series, you're essentially in a tomb this entire game, and there's a lot of shadow everywhere you look. That's probably its biggest strength and creepiest factor. Add an impressive sound design package and you've got a game that is, almost more than halfway there. The shrieks the mummies make when they disintegrate has stayed in my head since the dawn of time. But if you take a game like Tomb Raider and add Brendan Fraser, that's basically The Mummy in a nutshell. Each level sees Rick exploring different parts of Hamunaptra to find items necessary for progression. Along the way, he fights mummies, solves puzzles, and avoids booby traps. All of it sounds good on paper, but there are many things about this game that attempt to derail the fun, namely the controls. Rick's movement is stiff and tank-like, not even helped by the clunky jumping and climbing mechanics. He also has a dodge roll that covers 5 football fields, but the wind-up animation leaves him vulnerable to attack. The dodgy controls become a little tolerable after a while, but your patience will be tested many, many times. Levels are broken off by hub areas. To access new areas, you need to find whatever it is the other characters are looking for, be it pieces of a hieroglyph or canopic jars. The stages are broken into parts, so when an area is completed, you earn a key fragment. Obtaining all the pieces of the key is necessary to collect the end stage item. Additionally, collecting all treasures and defeating all enemies marks the current section as a perfect zone. The more perfect zones, the more rewards you unlock, like cheat codes and bonus levels, but I think most players, including myself, never cared that deeply to 100% it. Thankfully, we had this thing called the internet when I was a kid, so I would just look up cheat codes that granted infinite lives and ammo, invincibility, and all the weapons right out of the bat. The combat is really not good here either, and you have to dance around the general clunkiness of it all as best as you can. Rick does have a sizable array of melee and ranged weapons to use. You start off with revolvers, a machete, and a torch, but you also acquire a shotgun, a machine gun, and an ancient sword. Rick will auto-aim his weapons at the nearest enemy, but there's no real way to tell how well you're shooting or slugging at the rotting corpses. This is also around that era when the third-person view is tied to what direction the character moves, so there is no option to really scan your surroundings, especially if you're getting attacked from behind. You'll square off against an assortment of mummies, including slave mummies, warrior mummies armed with swords, shields, or spears, mummies with sledgehammers, and even spirit mummies, but they're all mostly one and the same. There are also grave robbers you briefly contend with, plus the scarabs, which is my favorite added touch, but the main threat is Imhotep, whom you have a very laughable boss fight with by the end. You'll also find treasures and hieroglyphs, which provide Rick with amulets that act as a screen-clearing weapon that instantly kills any enemies caught in its blast radius when thrown. Finding hieroglyphs and lighting them with your torch is how you earn extra levels. If you die, you start at the last checkpoint, but if you lose all lives, it's game over, and you restart from your last save point. However, most of your deaths won't be the result of the mummies, but the wonky platforming and set-piece movements. The game's set pieces involve Rick either surfing a log down the river or running away from scarabs, flies, fireballs, etc. The short draw distance leaves you little time to react to whatever springs up, plus it's very easy for Rick to get hung up on the environment. In the case of the log surfing, you need to jump or duck in the exact spot or else Rick will just get knocked off, and I swear his blockish movements are hyper delayed. Though they only last 30 seconds when done correctly, it can feel longer than that due to how cheap these parts are. Even the Benny chase plays out like a poor man's pitfall, and while Aksunanun's encounter is Pac-Man, but with more like a sexy mummy that'll mount and suck you off if you get caught, and I'm not joking, that is what happens. It's really bizarre to have boss fights designed in this way, but whatever it takes to mix things up, I guess.
Know this. This creature is a bringer of death. He will never eat, he will never sleep, and he will never stop.
And by this point, I'm sure you can tell that visually it's pretty unimpressive, even for 2000. Though the game stages consist of catacombs, tombs, and ancient ruins, objects and scenery will more often bleed into every puke-looking environment, not to mention the game can get very dim in places. And talk about these terrible character models. They look like they were processed through a rusty meat grinder, like someone took a cardboard box and slapped Brendan Fraser's head on it. Plus, his walking and running animations don't make any sense. He's like doing a up, 2, 3, 4 every other step. Other characters like Benny and Ardith look terrifying with how gaunt and jagged their designs are.
Yes, my prince.
Of course, none of the actors reprise their roles. Instead, we have voice actors doing really bad impressions.
Oh yeah, this just keeps getting better and better.
Like most movie tie-in games, The Mummy is mediocre. It found a lot of workarounds to be a cheap and unpolished game, but I won't lie and say that there is still some fun to be had. As I said earlier, the movie's adventurous tone is recreated pretty well, and you might get the occasional goosebump whenever you hear spooky voices emanating from parts unknown.
Something's not right here.
Jerry Goldsmith's score is used in full force here, and while some tracks get repeated, it's great music. I might be a bit blinded by nostalgia, but I will say that the PS1 era vibe it has will always be a little bit charming. And at least it doesn't set out to do the unthinkable, like dropping a trailer without sound effects or music.